A while ago, I tried to turn Wikipedia into a prompt generator for a journaling RPG, if you can imagine what that means. I tried to, but that idea didn't work, and it turned out that a lot more people were interested in the tool that I made for it. That tool was supposed to just be Wikipedia's random article search feature, but it turns out that that feature is actually pretty lame if you're trying to get it to give you random articles in a broad topic, like world mythology that can inspire fantasy stories. So I basically made the thing that I wanted it to be myself. A web page with a button that serves you a random Wikipedia article from some interesting corner of world folklore. I put together about 200 pages for it to choose from, but when everyone ignored the journal prompting idea and instead used the tool as world-building inspiration, I realized that this is actually a way to generate names, creatures, plot elements, magic MacGuffins for anyone who wants a surprising source of inspiration. That's when I really got to work, because I don't know if this is part of what made the game idea not work, but for all the inspiration that games like D&D draw from world mythology, RPGs have this weird problem where they kind of unravel a lot of what makes mythology interesting, and probably the best thing this tool can do for you as someone imagining a world is give you time to submerge yourself in the strange cultural milieu of myth before a modern medium turns it into something else. So what I did with the tool is make it much bigger. Instead of one button that shows you anything, there's now 6 categories: gods, monsters, heroes, magic items, realms, and tales. So you can find random inspiration for whatever you might be trying to make, or if you're just looking for a rabbit hole to drop into. There's well over 600 articles to find through this page now. If we're talking about all of Wikipedia, that's nowhere near comprehensive, but I didn't want comprehensive. I wanted inspiring. So a chunk of the things I collected for this tool are classic mythology and folklore. Things you might recognize, but hopefully will rediscover in a way you didn't expect. But most of what these buttons will show you are the most interesting things I could find that you might not know, but when you discover them, you'll want to know more. And that way, like me, you can have an unfortunate truth of fantasy world building that you've always felt slowly turn into a problem you'd like to do something about. If you don't want to talk about that right now, and you just want to play with this Wikipedia rabbit hole generator, then you can find the link in the description and go nuts. The tool is free, and there's a link to a free post on my Patreon where you can see the full list of all the articles, so you can check out anything that you might have missed. And if you find anything you think is really cool, then come back here and leave a comment about it. But if you want to have a frank conversation about world building and a possible problem with a lot of modern fantasy storytelling, especially through role-playing games, then I'm going to talk about Brandon Sanderson's lectures for a second. If you're watching this, you've probably seen his lecture series about world building, which struck me the first time I saw it, with how clarifying it was, yeah, but also that Sanderson's favorite Lord of the Rings movie is actually my least favorite. The Two Towers is great, and I get why the ending is so satisfying for him. But even as a teenager, I found the immense weight of the personal decisions that the characters in the Fellowship of the Ring make more interesting and powerful than anything I had seen before. It's so piercingly poignant how Frodo, at every turn, needs to make the hardest, bravest decision because selfless humility and love are the only things that can't be corrupted to the ring's ends. I also really appreciate a world having internal consistency and setting up and paying off satisfying solutions. And Sanderson also appreciates dramatic character choices, especially when they're driven by that consistency. So it's not like we have a problem here. I just think one of the crazy interesting things that's often laundered from myth in modern storytelling is that it's often the other way around. The dramatic choices of the characters in myth create the world with their unbound, kind of inconvenient creativity. The world building itself is about the characters and story in strange, fascinating ways that modern mediums, which are expected to be consistent and thorough with characters and stories existing in a pre-existing world, can learn a lot from. Like, one thing that's stuck with me for 20 years now is the definition one of my favorite teachers gave of mythology, which is stories that explain the way things are. They can explain why there are seasons, why snakes don't have legs, why rival families must feud forever. A lot of modern world building, especially in role-playing games, won't think of those explanations in terms of stories. They'll tend to think of it almost in terms of science. Meanwhile, ancient myth uses strange stories to explain even something like what happens when two mutually exclusive absolutes contradict each other. Look for Laylaps or the Tumessian fox in the monster section, because I had never heard of them before doing this, and I think it's time for you to dive into the rabbit hole with me. If you read about Laylaps, he's a magical hunting dog that can never fail to catch his prey, or is maybe just the fastest dog in the world, who is given to, or stolen by, a princess or nymph called Procris, whose husband uses it to hunt the legendary Tumessian fox. The Tumessian fox is a magical fox that can never be caught, or is a giant monster fox sent by the god Dionysus to torment the city of Thebes by hunting its children, or both, until the impossible task of hunting it is given to the Prince Amphitryon of Tiryns, who has the great idea of using Laylaps to hunt it. These two magical animals dip in and out of histories and tragedies and royal family lines, where they serve many narrative purposes with different world-building details. But when they're by themselves together, they answer a fun question about the world. What happens when an unevadable force pursues an uncatchable object? We'll get to that, but the constant retconning and rewriting and repurposing of world-building details for new characters and themes and story ideas is exclusively what you will find as you discover things through this tool. Stereotypically, all that world-building squishiness is not something nerds tend to appreciate in modern stories, but even Sanderson said that world-building takes a backseat to both characters and plot, maybe even starting with characters and plot and building the entire world around that, even if the characters and plot aren't exactly convenient for all the world-building you might want to do. And I think RPGs can learn a lot from this attitude, because next, we're going to talk about Medusa. Not Medusas, Medusa. If you were to ask an ancient Greek person, there's just the one Medusa, because that's the name of a Gorgon. And the Gorgons are a trio of primordial sister monsters, with one of them being Euryale, a name that might ring a bell in a minute. Medusa is the one we all know about because she was the one that was slain by Perseus after the gods kitted him out with a bunch of legendary magic items for a solo adventure. But if you ask D&D, Medusas are a type of monster. Maybe they're made by a curse nowadays, but in earlier editions, they're their own natural species that reproduce like anything else. And they even have a male counterpart, a Madar, that enables them to feed on their victims by unpetrifying them after the Medusa turns them to stone. That's what we call Gygaxian naturalism. The idea that the monsters in an RPG should be first understood as biological creatures with habitats and life processes. Gygax and the people creating D&D with him needed a system that rationalized the world that the players interact with in a tactical, physical, exploration-driven way with disposable monsters to encounter. So that's why the D&D Medusa went from being one of the Gorgon sisters to being the species of Medusas, and why the Gorgons became a species of bull monster in D&D. Though Gygax actually had a 17th century source there, which you might find if you click on the monster button enough, it's perhaps why Euryale went from being Medusa's sister to being a card in the deck of many things with a Medusa-like visage. The ancient Greek storytellers, however, needed Medusa to evoke a compelling theme and be slain in a cleverly creative duel. Like, in the earliest tellings, she and her sister are the offspring of primordial sea gods. She was a symbol of natural chaos and danger that the hero outsmarts and overcomes. Then, later Roman storytellers retold her origins as a tragedy. She was a lover of the god of the sea, cursed by the goddess of the hunt for procreating in the virgin goddess's temple. And her children with the sea god, birthed in the moment that Perseus beheads her, include Pegasus, the one flying horse creature. She's put out of the misery of her cursed fate and frees the majestic animal child of a god. Those are the questions that I am much more drawn to, and the things that you'll find these myths are much more interested in answering. What strange monstrosities have been left for us by the primordial gods of nature? What punishment will a vengeful goddess inflict on a mortal when the goddess has no power over the god who broke the taboo with her? What new things are possible when old bitterness and corruption are destroyed? Good world building is about interesting and satisfying lore details. Good stories are about characters making interesting and satisfying choices based on who they are, what they want, and how they're changing. Good mythology is about interesting stories creating an interesting world. One exception I will grant is the Warhammer 40k universe. I'm not really interested in its stories or characters, but I do find the world building really fascinating, even though, or maybe kind of because of, the fans who seem to think the Imperium is like admirable and noble somehow. Anyway, the Madar is a clever answer to how a Medusa eats, but I just think there are more interesting questions to answer, and more interesting answers to give, than the ones RPGs tend to have that are convenient for gameplay purposes, while awkwardly replacing storyful world building. There are RPGs that are better at thinking of creative questions and answers for their world building. A really simple, tiny example that I like is demons in Pathfinder, which are designed in terms of the vices they represent, and they have weaknesses that have to do with those vices. Like, a succubus takes damage when its advances are rejected, or a glubrizu takes damage when its lies are revealed. Does it make for an interesting, surprising storytelling moment that shows how these creatures are fundamentally about destructive vices and are literally unmade by virtue? Yes. And does that use the story of the demon's mechanics to establish something interesting about morality in the world? Double yes. Or when I first read Mage the Awakening, I was surprised to find that most, if not all, of the creatures in what you'd call its monster manual section are individuals. It isn't species of creatures that you mostly learn about through their biology, it's characters. Basically, mythological heroes and monsters whose stories create the game world in a Dark Soulsy kind of way, and the players will only ever encounter any of them once. These are games that have at least a toe sticking out of the world of mechanical consistency and convenience that RPGs demand, and draw from a world of story-rich mystery. Of course, that's easy for a game like Mage to do when it's not so much about tactical combat, and I guess that's kind of the point. Most game design tends to take us away from thinking of these creatures and stories in their most interesting forms, and makes us think about them in ways that are convenient for the game's mechanics. That's even a kind of disappointing thing about the new D&D Monster Manual, which I otherwise really like, but it doesn't need to be like that. So if you're making anything right now, like a story or art piece or game, try to spend some time soaking up the inconvenient strangeness of the myths in these articles. Then, when you go to write your story or make your art or design your game, bring some of that strangeness with you, and you'll make something that most people aren't seeing. I think they'll appreciate it. And what does happen when a dog who always catches its prey hunts a fox that always escapes its hunter? The gods turn them into constellations who can chase each other forever. Okay, I'm back with a lot of stuff that I've been working on. I'm trying to turn The Apprentice's Grimoire into a larger scale game, though I'm still not sure whether that actually should happen, because it seems pretty great just as it is, and it's free, but I'm also working on something that definitely will be a decent sized game, like 50 or 60 pages, and I'm very excited about that one. Imagine Ironsworn, but it's a post-apocalyptic exploration game that's randomly generated by Google Maps and Google Street View. So until one of those is done, I have a few other videos talking about other related game design things that I want to do. So subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you then.